And so here we go. And so just feel free to comment along the way. So this is The Problem of Taste to the Experimental Test by Filippo Contesi, Enrico Torroni, Marta Campa della Cruz, Ramon Garcia Moya, and Genoveva Marti. And it looks like they're out of, Genoa and Barcelona mostly. Hope it doesn't taste like a golden turd. Yeah, me too. Never know. A lot of these analysis papers, they make a nice little analytic point, but a lot of times it doesn't matter to like the general population. But like, what are you going to do? Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not, but that's a lot of philosophy. Okay. But I like these ones because I feel like, when you're talking about like tastes and smells and things like that, at least it gives people, something to talk about, think about. All right, here we go. A fundamental question in aesthetics is whether or not aesthetic judgments are subjective. Indeed, Nick Zangwill calls this the big question in aesthetics. One of the major pieces of evidence to answer that question has traditionally been taken to be what the majority of people say and do concerning aesthetic matters. One major tension, sometimes called the paradox of taste, has been noticed. Taste seems proverbially described as something subjectively valid, but people seem to treat taste judgments as if they were not subjective. For instance, they engage in disputes, defer to experts, or discard certain views as absurd. As Crispin Sartwell writes, taste is proverbially subjective. So it's de gustibus non est disputatandum. About taste, there is no disputing. On the other hand, we do frequently dispute about matters of taste, and some persons are held up as exemplars of good taste or of tastelessness. Some people's tastes appear vulgar or ostentatious, for example. Some people's taste is too exquisitely refined, while that of others is crude, naive, or non-existent. Taste that appears to be both subjective and objective. Yeah, Tommy. Well, the question is actually, I don't know. This may actually be old. I think this is actually an old claim. So yes, it is unnecessarily stuff, but it is kind of funny to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to quote the Latin for 500 years ago because like this is one of the times when it's an old debate. So yes, but like it is kind of nice to be in like, I'm just talking about something old. So yeah. So yes, prof, if you aren't doing the Latin, you aren't doing the middle period. I am guilty of referencing Peter Abelard in one of my recent papers, and let me tell you, it's fun to be like, I'm referencing his book in 1120. It's like, yeah, I feel like, hey, I'm actually getting to talk about something that people have been discussing for a little while. So it might just be making myself feel better, and maybe the authors be like, hey, we're talking about real philosophy here. Like, this is not some like fly-by-night thing. This is like we're actually discussing stuff, but who the hell knows? I mean, again, it's just making it look fancy. It doesn't make it any good. And I mean, this all makes sense right now. Like, I like vanilla, you like chocolate. Are we going to argue about that? That'd be a stupid argument. But then again, you have wine tasting people, and there are like better wines and worse wines, and these people consistently pick out the better wines. So like, yeah. Yeah, so you quote Aristotle in the Greek, sometimes it feels fancy as fuck, not gonna lie. Exactly. So these are the little things that amuse philosophers, and you want to forgive some of them. Now, if they keep this up the whole time, yes, then they're being ostentatious. That they do it once, in a quote and like right here also, which is already excessive. They did it twice within 2 sentences. But like if they keep it up, then they're being excessive. I'm gonna give them their just like moment of diversion or whatever, not diversion, but yeah. You're also your favorite antinomy is in the first footnote. Other names for the same tension exist. Sartwell, for instance, calls it the antinomy of taste, following Kant's terminology. Yes, but you're a dirty Kantian, so whatever. Aesthetics has so far debated at length what account to give to the tension. However, the existence of the tension itself has been acknowledged since human Kant. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yeah. And I guess, so Hume said it first anyway. Alright, more recently, a series of papers reporting experimental results have questioned the existence of this tension. Most notably, Kova et al., but also Kova and Payne, Kova, Goffin, and Kova forthcoming. Goodwin and Darley, Rab, and Andow also report similar results. You haven't showered since NAM. Yeah, exactly. All those studies show that a vast majority of people endorse claims that support aesthetic subjectivism. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard. You're going to say, look, some people do like certain foods and other people don't, and it's pointless to argue about that. Now, what is the source of the pointlessness? Is it a subjective thing, or is it something else? Are we talking across purposes? I guess that's what they're trying to answer here. According to Kova et al. 2019, this demonstrates that the traditional way of approaching the debate over the nature of aesthetic judgment is fundamentally misguided, and that philosophical inquiries about the nature of aesthetic judgments should no longer take the explicit belief in intersubjective validity and how to explain it as a starting point. Yeah, thanks for the lurk, Prof. Appreciate it. What you want again? This hand, yeah, because again, I guess if you put your hand in the river, it's not the same hand, it's not the same river. Right? Like if you're going to wash your hands, so then how would you actually know any epistemology? Okay. Damn it, Frank. Thank you also, Tindarius, for the lurk. Yeah. In this paper, we show that such claims are based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the tension and that the empirical results in question are irrelevant to showing that the tension does not exist. We note, however, that the nature of the tension has not been properly clarified in the literature. To remedy this, we suggest 6 different axes under which the tension can be conceptualized. By taking those axes into account, we show that the aforementioned empirical results do not dissolve the tension. Okay, so we're actually doing a little meta analysis on science here with like a philosophical eye. That's fine. Psychological experiments and the philosophical tradition. Yeah. Excuse me. At least he's honest. Well, yeah. Sometimes you gotta, sometimes it's not you don't want to tell everyone the truth, you know? Sometimes it's better to keep it to yourself, at least for a while. I mean, I'm not telling you to lie. I'm just telling you sometimes there's other things that could have been said. And that's very Kantian of me, I guess. I'll tell you to lie. Sometimes it's okay. Go ahead. Here we will focus primarily on the most comprehensive experimental study of the intersubjectivity of aesthetic taste to date, that is, Kova et al. 2019. They set out to test 2,392 participants in 19 countries across 4 continents. The participants were invited to describe something they find very beautiful and imagine someone disagreeing with them. Then they were asked to choose among the following 3 options, specifying how certain they were of their choice. 1. Both of you is correct while one of you is correct while the other is not. Both of you are correct. 3. Neither is correct. It makes no sense to talk about correctness in this situation. The results show that an underwhelming number of people, that's 7%, chose option 1. Yeah, so if you say this painting is beautiful and they say that painting is ugly, then they're saying, well, you know, maybe it's not just one person's objectively correct. Those results are consistent across cultures. Indeed, they universalize similar results by Kova and Payne 2012 in a study that was performed with a much smaller and non-multicultural sample. Since the endorsement of subjectivism about aesthetic judgments is very robust, Kova et al. Conclude that the traditionally postulated paradox of taste does not exist. Kova et al.'s experiments, like all other empirical studies of this question, use lay people's explicit statements. They ask participants to choose among competing explicit beliefs about aesthetic judgments, that is, whether 2 people who disagree in their aesthetic assessment can both be right, whether one of them has to be wrong, or whether it makes no sense to adjudicate in these matters. The problem with that strategy is that, in large part, the aesthetics literature on the paradox of taste has not taken explicit beliefs in intersubjective validity as the main evidence for the existence of the paradox of taste. As we've seen with Sartwell's quote earlier, the problem is that aestheticians consider the most puzzling. Instead, the problem that aestheticians consider most puzzling instead is that people declare to agree with statements such as, now they pull out the Latin, de gustibus non disputatum est, and then they go on to do and say things that are not in line with what they explicitly endorsed. Okay, so here's the thing. The problem is that people say one thing and do something else. So if you're asking what people say, they're all going to say the same thing, and that's not the problem. The problem is that they say one thing and then they don't follow what they say. So it's interesting. It's that if you scientifically test for it, you can't use a questionnaire. Like, that doesn't work. You have to actually go see how they behave. So it's saying all these psych tests that ask people questions just missed the entire point. Okay. For instance, Kova et al. Themselves quote Noel Carroll saying, quote, People involved in disputes about aesthetic properties act as though they think they are disagreeing about the real properties of objects. They behave as though they think that there is a fact of the matter to be determined. They speak as if one side of the disagreement is right and the other wrong. Tindera says, but we can smell it. Twitch has just had a new olfaction update. Now you can smell everything in the streamer's room. Do you know that the spraying deodorant doesn't solve the problem? That would be the most disgusting thing possible for Twitch to actually do. Because, yeah, you got to remember streamers are sitting in their chair for 12 hours, some of them. It's got to be rank and horrid in some of those streams. Really, it's just got to be the worst. Seriously, people don't get up for hours and hours and they're sitting, and computers make heat. So you need and you can't run your air conditioning because it makes too much noise. So they're sitting in hot, sweaty environments. And yeah, it would be terrible. That would be the last feature for them to make. Granted, I wouldn't be surprised if other streaming sites added, more interactivity, but Twitch, no. I mean, people buy streamers' bathwater. So it's they are interested in, tastes and sounds and smells that are not available through Twitch. But, yeah, only certain people's bathwater. I think someone was even selling farts. Yeah, someone sold farts, jars of farts. They farted into a jar and sold that. So it's yeah. So it is a thing, but it's very, very selective. All right. Carol does not, and back to the philosophy, continuing. Carol does not here take the explicit belief in intersubjective validity as a starting point. He starts from the consideration that in talking about aesthetic properties, people act in certain ways. For example, they get involved in disputes. Toad PhD stream would just smell like perfume, trust me. Exactly. Well, I'm sure Toad smells good. He seems to take care of himself. From this fact, he draws the conclusion that they must believe that aesthetic properties are objective. This, however, is the conclusion of an argument to the best explanation, rather than one of its premises. The important premise of such an argument is that people engage in certain kinds of not only linguistic but non-linguistic behavior. Yeah, so that's the thing. In this debate, it's about the behavior of people. So yeah. Our stream would just smell like wet dog. Yes, that's did something just happen? Oh dear, this is OBS updates. Be careful about them. But yeah, yes, I'm pretty sure it would smell like Lala. Okay. Likewise, Zhang Will, quoted by Kova et al. As well, says, quote, both realism and non-realism are on a par as far as the experimental aspect of aesthetics is concerned, but when it comes to explaining the normativity of aesthetic judgments, the realist is ahead. I conclude that folk aesthetics is thus realist. Whether or not the tacit folk metaphysical commitment to aesthetic facts or states of affairs is justified is another matter, but our aesthetic judgment presupposes that metaphysics. Okay, so they're still saying that people behave as if there's objective good and bad. So it's if you have poop, say we got some poop, is that objectively bad tasting to people? And some people have very, very strange eating habits. There's what's it called, that thing from Scandinavia where they bury fish in the sand for a year, letting it ferment, and apparently everyone who's not used to eating it does not do very well the first time a can of that stuff is opened. So it's you might think that there's no way that is objectively bad tasting, but apparently you can learn to like it. So that'd be a thing, So, but we act as if there is a bad, even though also that you can learn to like things that would otherwise make you gag, or make you gag on the first try, but not on the next try. You know that fish? Yeah, this is a known thing. It's I think people, even streamers, open that stuff on stream for the shits and giggles of having the reaction. Okay. Here, Zhang Will is pointing out an advantage of realism and hence intersubjectivism about aesthetic judgments. Yeah, I don't know how to say it, but that looks like what I think it is. So, surströmming, something like that. Yeah. Zhang Will's starting point is the folk's ordinary practice of making aesthetic judgments. This folk practice, he suggests, is committed to the existence of aesthetic facts and hence is unproblematically in accord with realism. Moreover, as he clearly points out, such folk commitment is tacit. That, he claims, is the metaphysics that our aesthetic judgments presuppose. Yeah, so people are just saying, things taste good and taste bad, and that's just how it is. And we presuppose it. Okay, finally, Rab et al. Also clearly state, two common observations about aesthetics are in tension: that people generally consider aesthetic judgments subjective, and that people generally behave like objectivists, arguing over judgments, making choices based on judgments of trusted critics, rejecting strong assertions of aesthetic equivalence. It's like, yeah, we do definitely take the opinion that, like, I have my flavor, you have your flavor, but then there is also an authority on it, like critics. All these examples illustrate that, on the whole, aestheticians do not conceive of the paradox of taste as a tension between explicit beliefs in subjectivism and explicit beliefs in intersubjectivism. Yeah, so it's a do one thing, say one thing, do another sort of paradox. And that is fair. If that's how people are, then it's an interesting phenomenon. We have shown that the tension inherent in the paradox of taste is not one between explicit beliefs, but perhaps because aestheticians have always agreed on the existence of the tension, little effort has gone into the analyzing precisely what the tension is. So it is worth reflecting further on what the tension consists in. The authors previously cited exemplified another recurrent feature in the traditional understanding of the paradox of taste, that is the alignment between explicitness and beliefs on the one hand and implicitness and behaviors on the other. In other words, the aesthetician's tradition notices the subjectivist viewpoint mainly in explicit beliefs like that expressed by the dictum de gustibus non disputandum est. By contrast, the intersubjectivist viewpoint is mainly seen as remaining implicit in patterns of behavior. Yeah, so again, say one thing, do the other, and they're just saying the Latin because they now are having fun saying the Latin whenever they can. The conceptualization of the paradox of taste as a belief-behavior tension is distinct from its conceptualization as an explicit-implicit tension. But the belief-behavior and implicit-explicit axes are clearly connected, where implicit beliefs are theoretically postulated in order to explain the way in which people behave. For instance, what they say when they interact with others or when they disagree with others' aesthetic judgments. Thus, Carroll concludes his previously mentioned description of folks' aesthetic behavior as follows. So they at least must believe that aesthetic properties are objective. That is the way of understanding their behavior that renders it most intelligible. You know, I'm wondering, how objective do you really think it is? There is better food. Like, there's bad food, but it's still food, and someone can say, I like this and I don't like that. There's like, but you'd be like, okay, this other food is like better. And if someone would say, like, are these on par? You'd think there was something that was like deficient about them. If you've got two things that are really like sort of just like a better version of one thing. Like you've got like, really plain cake and then like fancy cake, and you're talking about cake and someone's like, no, they're equally good. It's like, not really. They're not the same. And if like you don't like the icing, you can say you don't like the icing. But like if it's like cake with icing and cake without icing, and the icing's really good, and someone's like, well, they're exactly the same, you're like, nah, that one has icing, that one doesn't. You don't like the icing. They say, no, I do like the icing, but they're exactly the same cake. You're like, well, why would you not like the added icing if they, that one doesn't have it? Pretty subjective, depends on the person. You see, maybe that's a thing. Maybe it's a scope problem. It's subjective when it comes to your own taste, but when it's like intersubjective, then it becomes like a behavioral issue. And so that's an interesting thing. Yeah, like your personal tastes are subjective, but when you get into arguing with people, then it's not. So maybe it's a social problem. Maybe that's also, that's a great point in Darius. Maybe there's an issue with the social ontology of taste when we're talking about it in groups versus when you're talking about it individually. For example, Russian sweets are way too sweet for me, but loved by many. Yeah. So maybe this is really a social ontology problem here and not something else. Like that's an interesting way of putting it. Okay. Okay, Kova et al. Asked participants to choose among competing explicit beliefs on aesthetic judgments, but in general, one cannot infer someone's implicit beliefs from their explicit avowals, nor that she will behave according to the latter. For example, it is well established that many people endorse explicitly non-racist beliefs, and yet they behave as if they believe the opposite by, for example, not taking into further consideration the CVs of candidates with black-sounding names, such as Jamal or Lakeisha, even when they have the same qualifications as candidates with white-sounding names, such as Emily or Greg. Yeah, there's a famous study that showed this. It's like, so what people have started doing was hiding the names, or, using a fake middle name or something. So you could be like Jamal George Smith, and then you just use George Smith and be like, okay, his name is George Smith. So it's like, because otherwise people, don't look at your resume. If Kova et al.'s strategy were applied to this case, we would have to reach the odd conclusion that such people were obviously not racist. Okay, towards the end of their paper, both Kova and Payne and Kova et al. 2019 briefly mentioned the tension between explicit beliefs and implicit commitments as revealed by behavior. What they do not acknowledge is that the tension is, in fact, the paradox of taste itself, as it is understood in aesthetics. More importantly, they certainly do not test that tension. The problem, as we have argued, is that people declare to agree with the statement, and then they go on to do and say things that are not in line with what they have explicitly endorsed. As a consequence, Kova et al.'s result cannot be taken as they claim to invalidate the aesthetics tradition. On the contrary, their experiments contribute to establishing it. In fact, their results confirm what aestheticians already knew. That is, people explicitly endorse the claim of subjectivism. Yeah, so basically, the article here is it laid out a little bit of the science, argued that the philosophers conceive of it differently, and then showed that the science here is undercut by what the philosophers actually are claiming, that it only looked at half the phenomena, what people say, and not what they do. To sum up, if one conceptualizes the paradox of taste along the belief-behavior axis, showing that the tension suggested by the paradox does not exist would require showing that the folk behave in a subjectivist way. However, Kova et al.'s experiments primarily test folks' belief rather than their behaviors. Likewise, if one conceptualizes the paradox along the explicit-implicit axis, dissolving the tension would require showing that folk hold implicit subjectivist beliefs. But the experiments under discussion only test folks' explicit beliefs. Besides these two main axes, there is at least a third way of conceptualizing the paradox of taste implicit to the aesthetics tradition. This is as a contrast between people's aesthetic judgments and people's judgments about aesthetic judgments. When thinking about disagreements between aesthetic judgments, people often wax subjectivist, endorsing the proverbial de gustibus non disputandum est. Such judgments are about aesthetic judgments and about aesthetic disputes. They are, in an important sense, meta-aesthetic, and sometimes their subjectivist tone may contrast with the things that people do and say when they engage in arguments as to, say, whether something is or is not beautiful. True, this may be the case even at the level of fully explicit beliefs at which Kova et al.'s tests operate. Yet, even if we conceptualize the tension as the meta-aesthetic axis, dissolving the tension would require showing that folk make aesthetic statements in a subjectivist fashion. By contrast, Kova et al.'s experiments primarily test folks' meta-aesthetic avowals. Yeah, so if you ask people, it's different from then just showing what they like. And you can, not do this even explicitly in behavior, but you'd have to be way more careful when you ask people about what they would do in a situation, as opposed to actually having it come up and them do something. No matter how we conceptualize the tension inherent in the paradox of taste, Kova et al. Do not test it. Hence, they do not show that the tension does not exist. Neither do they show that there is anything radically wrong in this respect with the traditional aesthetics approach. Okay, 3 additional axes. So this is interesting. They look like they've already established the point that they were setting out to do, and now what they're going to do here, I'm not entirely sure what they're going to do. They're going to keep going. They're just going to keep going, and they're going to add a little bit more axes. Maybe they're going to try to, flesh out what the tension actually is. I'm not sure the strategy, because, I guess they made their point, but maybe now they got to, their point was kind of, the scientists are wrong. So my guess is they're going to try to shore up a little bit more of the philosophy here to be like, yeah, and our philosophy is good. So yeah, drawing on claims made by several contemporary aestheticians, we have identified 3 main axes on which the paradox of taste is usually conceptualized. Nonetheless, other less common conceptualizations of the paradox may be hypothesized, especially if one draws on Hume's and Kant's original and less straightforwardly interpretable formulations. In the attempt to be most charitable to Kova et al.'s challenge, we identify in this last section 3 additional axes of the conceptualization. The first additional axis conceptualizes the paradox of taste as a tension between explicitly subjectivist general meta-aesthetic beliefs, such as that expressed by the proverb de gustibus non disputandum est, and explicitly intersubjective meta-aesthetic beliefs about a particular case, such as those we express during a dispute concerning particular aesthetic judgments. For example, Monet's impression sunrise is beautiful. This axis draws a distinction between the general and particular, and unlike the three previous axes, it postulates the tension completely at the level of meta-aesthetic explicit beliefs. As a consequence, understanding the paradox of taste along this fourth axis would lead to the conclusion that the experimental results discussed challenge the claim that folk hold intersubjectivist beliefs about particular cases. Okay, so this is closer to what I think Tyndareus might have been saying. So we can discuss stuff, but in the particular case, then we can disagree. All right, so like in general, we have like different tastes, but in particular ones, it's different. So it's different in the individual versus the general. It's not exactly what I got from what Tyndareus was saying, because it depends on the person, but it might depend on the particularity. That's what the authors are saying here. On this understanding, an experimental participant who finds Monet's masterpiece very beautiful and imagines someone else disagreeing ought to conclude that the other person is wrong. By contrast, the experimental results show that most people do not reach that conclusion. Yeah. So in the particular, then you'd have to say it'd be different, but that's not what it shows. However, this does not vindicate Kova et al.'s conclusion that the aesthetic tradition is wrong to assume that the paradox of taste exists. Get away from me, bug. Firstly, understanding the paradox along this general particular axis is by no means common. None of the contemporary texts earlier discussed may be interpreted along that axis. The only possibility would be drawn some of the 18th century sources, for example, Hume, when he contrasts beliefs valid about aesthetic taste generally. The proverb has justly determined it to be fruitless to dispute concerning tastes, and beliefs valid only about particular cases. Whoever would assert an equality of genius and elegance between Ogleby and Milton would be thought to defend no less an extravagance than he had maintained a molehill to be as high as Tenerife. Okay, so this is interesting. So the proverb is determined to be fruitless to dispute concerning taste. So that's saying you can't argue taste, but like if you did understand that these two poets were equal, then you'd be conflating a mountain with a molehill. Okay, so is this really, well, the author will say, I mean, I have something to say about that too, but author might as well. However, this interpretation of Hume would be uncommon. Most aestheticians understand Hume as focusing instead on a contrast between implicit commitments to intersubjectivism and explicit beliefs in subjectivism, that is, conceptualizing the paradox along the first two axes. Even if accurate as an interpretation of Hume, moreover, such an understanding of the paradox of taste would be misaligned from the more recent aesthetic traditions. As we've seen in section 1, more recent aestheticians conceptualize the paradox in accordance with the more common interpretation of Hume. Indeed, Kova et al. Themselves quote Hume and also Kant, together with the contemporary aestheticians such as Carroll and Zangwill, who definitely do not understand the paradox of taste according to this peculiar interpretation. As a consequence, challenging the paradox along the general particular axis would not challenge the whole aesthetic tradition, as Kova et al. Claim. Okay, this is interesting. This is still not got the social that I was discussing with Tyndareus, though, because if it's really just an individual versus general, that's not the same thing. So it's not a question of social ontology. It's an individual versus a general statement, and apparently no one believes that. And you could only sort of like shoehorn Hume into it, but like no one actually thinks Hume meant that either. Okay. A fifth possible conceptualization of the paradox of taste revolves around the distinction between presumed taste experts and the folk. In other words, one could understand the paradox as a tension between more common laypeople's subjectivist leanings and the intersubjectivist viewpoint of a person who is or considers themselves to be of good taste. And this gets back to our previous discussion earlier tonight, when someone has a preferred vantage point. So they have a preferred viewpoint, and so they see the world better from wherever they are. So their perspective is not, equally good as other people's. It is better than other people's. Such an understanding of the paradox is, again, uncommon in the aesthetics tradition as a whole. However, the other classical 18th century source of the paradox, that is Kant, can be understood as also putting forward such an understanding. This may be seen in his apparent attribution of the subjectivist viewpoint to the layperson, whilst the intersubjectivist stance is proper to anyone who plumes himself on his taste. However, Coverell never asked participants whether they consider themselves persons of taste. Hence, they cannot be taken to be testing the paradox along this axis either. So, I mean, this is the question. What are experts doing? And in that case. So this is a problem. We don't have experts then if everyone actually has equal things. But what do experts actually do then? Okay. I guess, and the authors know this is the question. A final axis, again, one that draws on some feature of Kant's texts, but has been uncommon in the aesthetics tradition since, revolves around his distinction between the agreeable and the beautiful. Kant claims that subjectivist and intersubjectivist viewpoints align to the proper use of the qualifications agreeable and beautiful, respectively. Accordingly, the paradox of taste might be conceptualized as a tension between the subjectivist attitudes associated with the term agreeable and the objectivist attitudes associated with beautiful. However, the distinction between the agreeable and the beautiful is not obviously a pre-theoretical distinction that is readily available to the folk. Ordinary judgments about something being beautiful are often made to simply express the subject's pleasing experience. When someone says their day was beautiful, they are not appealing to any intersubjective standards of beauty, but only expressing their own subjective sentiment that they enjoyed their day. Again, this is getting closer to the social again. But yeah. Ivan, are they assuming aesthetic realism is false? Yeah, they're assuming that people are behaving as if aesthetic realism is true, but saying that aesthetic realism is false. That's kind of the problem here. They're saying it's false, but then they're acting like no, like there are right and wrong answers. Because when you ask them like, oh, what's better, then they actually, they pick one. So, yeah. I mean, the authors here were saying, they're arguing against people who were saying that aesthetic realism was false. Yeah, because that's what everyone reported when you ask them questions. They say, oh no, everyone has like their own taste, so there are no like objective aesthetic judgments. But when you watch what they do, they don't do as they say, and so that's the problem here. It's like, what is it that people are doing? So yeah. Ivan says, I ask because I see intersubjectivism as compatible with both realism and anti-realism. Yeah, so at this point, the idea is that if there was an intersubjective realist, yeah, I figure you should be able to make that distinction. That's fair. But I think they're talking about intersubjective realism here. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But they're treating it like, there is an objective truth between a group of people that is intersubjective that they should be able to agree upon. So yeah, it's like, even though different people can have different opinions, sometimes there is a realist, like, beautiful for this. And for Kant, I'm pretty sure there would be a beautiful. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not a Kant scholar. But like the idea, it's like it is objective here. And that would be what I think Kant is saying. Yes, the objective attitudes associated with beautiful. So the idea here, at least for Kant, is that beautiful is something objective. And you should all, and it looks like it's intersubjective. So you should all be able to come to that conclusion. Yeah, so they're saying, but the everyday way people use beautiful is not in Kant's technical term. So people aren't using beautiful as Kant did. Okay. If one wants to test if Kant was right that people have explicit intersubjective beliefs about the beautiful, so there'd be intersubjective objective beliefs about the beautiful. So I guess these people are conflating what you say you make a distinction about. But like, yeah. So I guess what they mean by intersubjective here is objective. The test should be devised in such a way that the participants should first be primed for the conceptual distinction between the agreeable and the beautiful, and then see whether that is a real distinction that they normally rely on. To that purpose, the experimental tests under discussion are unhelpful, as they are designed in a way that overlooks any distinction between the agreeable and the beautiful. As a consequence, they do not test the paradox along this sixth axis. To sum up, experimental studies that question the existence of the paradox of taste do not challenge the existence of the paradox as it is commonly understood in the aesthetics tradition. Indeed, those studies confirm what aestheticians predicted all along, that is, that people explicitly endorse subjectivist beliefs. We can conclude for the time being that the paradox of taste is alive and well. It is just more complex than aestheticians and experiments alike have assumed. Okay. Ivan says, it is really true that 97% of men think Pamela Anderson is beautiful. For example, I mean, I have no idea. I mean, what tabloid did you get that from, Ivan? Like, what tabloid are you reading, and what were their experimental methods? Because, like, I have no problem with Pamela Anderson. But yeah, it's like, what are you asking there, Ivan? Okay, so we have anything else to say here? Like, this wasn't a complicated paper, but it is kind of nice. Like, I have no real beef with what they're saying. Maybe they could have said a bit more about, like, the paradox and, like, how to draw out a paradox of what people say and what people do. Like, what they say versus how they behave. But, like, they made their point, and, I thought they made it okay in the way they did it. Okay, so I had to remake this scene after it broke down last week. But everyone in chat is now free to review. And what you do by reviewing, all you have to do is you put one of the emotes into your chat while the screen's up. So yeah, this is the paper. Thank you for... You can type exclamation point paper. But like, yeah, so if you think this was a good paper, you can say vote yay. So you just give it the general thumbs up. That's a general Twitch emote, so everyone should be able to see that in chat. But then, like, so we've got the brain dance up here. Was this fun? Did it give you fun ideas, make your brain dance? Did this make big claims that shriveled up? That'd be the grapes. Was it navel gazing only for academics? That'd be the nog navel. Ouroboros is for deep or ancient ideas. Nog extreme existential or artistic drama. The turd, was it all style, no substance? Was it just poop underneath? And the knife, was it slicing and dicing arguments? So yeah, so Ivan gives it a yay, little navel gaze, and a little slice and dice. Yeah, so this is fair. I'm actually going to give it a nog scream. I don't get it often enough to use that because it is a little bit about artistic drama here and aesthetic drama. So we're going to do a nog scream on this. I'm also going to say vote yay. I think it was it's an interesting little paradox where people say one thing and then they do another and it's consistent. So yeah. You rated positively because I immediately saw the flaw in the study they critique. Yeah, so I think they had a solid idea. They presented it well. And so this, I know, actually, to be fair, this is like your definition of philosophy. To like show scientists when they fuck up and like to make sure that like you're doing good science. This is one of those times where it's a little bit of philosophers correcting the science. So yeah. So... do I want to give it a nog knife? Yeah, it's a little analytic, so we're going to give it a nog knife. So I'm going to give it a, I don't care about nasal gazing on this one. But thank you for rating, Ivan and Tindarios. But yeah, so it's like a little slice and dice. That's what they did. They cut up someone else's argument. It was on the aesthetic lines, and it's interesting that they were able to maintain their distinction between what people say and what people do. A little bit of fun. Was it a whole lot of fun ideas? No. I use brain dance a lot, but it's not anything there. They didn't like screw up any of their big claims. No deep ideas on this. I mean, they pulled out the Latin for their to say like you can't. There's no arguing in matters of taste. But like that's not that's the best they could do is they get to quote Latin once. So it's like that's it. Because it is a slightly old problem going back to at least Hume, and earlier, but still. And all style, no substance. No, I mean they made their point. Wasn't a huge point, but they made their point. Okay, so thank you all for being here. By the way, appreciate it, and thank you for rating. Yeah, that's why you gave them the nog navel. Yeah. It's fair. I'm not like disagreeing with anyone here. This is again just a matter of taste. So everyone can have their own little thing, but of course I'm right. So even though you guys have your taste, you are just wrong.